Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, November 22nd, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election, a prediction between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, a rematch that we have been largely expecting based off of Donald Trump's continued presence in politics, and Joe Biden, who seems to be consistently staying the way he is as president of the United States, not even indicating that he might not run in 2024. And generally speaking, when you have an incumbent who is gearing up to remove themselves from politics or decide ultimately that they don't want to run for re-election, you start to see early signs of that. And unfortunately for the GOP, Joe Biden seems to be, or maybe fortunately at this point in time, honestly, Joe Biden seems to be in a position where he is gearing up for a 2024 presidential bid. And it makes sense. Both of these candidates I could realistically see facing off against each other in any number of realities. Joe Biden, as the incumbent president, is more than likely to run than he is not to run. In addition to that, Donald Trump probably is also more likely to run than he is to not run altogether, especially following some of these larger victories for the GOP at the end of 2021 and narrowing up of races, which means if 2022 goes well with Donald Trump's involvement, he will have the necessary means and people to get him back into the White House or potentially very, very close. So looking at this map here, first of all, before we actually get into it, I want to say that I apologize for not uploading for the past 2 days. I went to a football game on Saturday, and it was a very long day. We left at 7 a.m. and we came back at 11 p.m., so it was a very long day. I lost my voice entirely from Saturday and Sunday, so I was unable to make videos, and even now you can still hear some strain in my voice, so I do apologize for that, but I think that it's getting back to a point where I can start to make routine content for you guys again. But pretty much this prediction is going to be very interesting to say the least. We are going to be working with the same characterizations, the solid states being safe red, the likely states, of course, likely, lean meaning a little bit closer, and then the tilt being the closest that I will characterize. I'm not going to leave any states blank. Right now, I think that this map definitely deserves all states to be characterized, but take everything that I'm saying as a sort of indicator of where we are today. These projections are not made as ones that I am simply putting out there just to eventually be right in 2024. These are my predictions for the election today. If we were to hold the presidential election and everyone had all this preparation and everything leading up to it with the current numbers, with the current approvals, with the current state of the nation, what would the numbers be? This is how I've been doing them from 2017 onward. And again, do not take this as my eventual prediction. Don't come back to this video in 2024 and say, you were wrong. It'd be nice if I was right, but you were wrong, just looking at it. So don't take it in that way, please. Just understand that this is more of a snapshot, an instant one that's great for tracking in the future, rather than just a simple understanding of what I expect to see 3 years down the line. So looking at this electoral map, some things simply do not change. Many of these states are going to remain safe, and because we are a very polarized nation, even though some states may currently disapprove of Joe Biden, they may be less inclined to vote for Donald Trump again. And you have to understand that Donald Trump is entering in as a failed re-election bid type president. He was the 2020 Republican nominee for president of the United States, and we all know this. I mean, he got 232 electoral votes, and Joe Biden got 306. Coincidentally, it was the exact opposite back in 2016. So when Donald Trump lost in 2020, he had promised to his voters that they were never going to see him again, that he was not going to show his face back in American politics. Now, I think many of us knew this wasn't true. Many of us realized that Donald Trump's influence extended, number one, beyond Donald Trump, and that he still has a wave to ride. The GOP has turned, in essence, the party of Donald Trump. So he seems to be the front runner for 2024 in every regard. But despite Joe Biden winning this presidential election in 2020, some more recent polling numbers have showed that Donald Trump is actually doing better than Joe Biden on the national numbers. In addition to this, we can take a look at the preliminary data for 2024, especially some of the data that's more recent. Earlier on in the year, Joe Biden did well against Donald Trump, sometimes the lead being as much as, you're talking anywhere from 4 points to nearly 20 points. Obviously, big differences there. Ultimately, it was never going to be as large of a 20-point victory. And back in April, I honestly did not think, and it probably wasn't a 4-point race at that point in time. But as things started to get closer and closer and closer to the end of 2021, starting around August, this is the same time that Donald Trump and Joe Biden started to converge down into a different level of approval and disapproval, higher disapprovals, both in 2017 and 2021. It seems to be the standard case for most presidents too, including Barack Obama, including George W. Bush, with his second term being taken into account, not necessarily the first one. But looking at the numbers here, the trajectory turned from Biden to Trump, then Trump, Biden won, Trump won, Biden won, Trump. And then it started to be a little consistent for Biden, very narrowly at that. You're talking at most a 6-point lead and narrowing up to a 2-point lead. And then Trump started to actually lead in most of the recent polls. You have more ties and Trump leads than you have Biden leads, and this is very worrisome for the Democratic Party. So this puts our race into context. We know that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are set to face again another close election, and it makes sense. We are in a time period where our elections are going to be extremely polarized, and we're not really going to see heavy amounts of support in one way or another. I think that when I say heavy amounts of support more than another political party. I think even though Joe Biden may be unpopular right now, you're not going to see some type of 400-vote electoral landslide. The same way that when Donald Trump lost his election back in 2020, his approval rating at that point in time was about 45%. Now, Joe Biden's today is only 43%, so he actually performs worse nationwide than Donald Trump did. But even then, with the majority of the nation, about 8 points more of the nation, disapproving of Donald Trump in the 2020 election, he still only lost the popular vote by a margin of about 4.5%, which means that when you move into the, breakdown, you see that there are voters who disapproved of Donald Trump, yet voted for Donald Trump primarily because they did not want to vote for a Democrat. Because they were so polarized, they may have said, I don't like how Donald Trump is treating the office, but I refuse to vote for a Democrat. And the same can be applied in the opposite scenario. So in this case, I want to point out that there will be, it will be a very, I would say, not necessarily very, but there will be some close contentious elections, and it makes sense. Now, don't worry too much about these likely characterizations. I think that right now we're just talking about some decreased amounts of support for the Democratic Party, potentially the Republican Party with a rerun nominee. Altogether, though, I do think that we are working within a completely new electoral map, which we are, in a new type of electorate, simply because the public perception on Joe Biden has changed dramatically, right? On Election Day back in 2020, he was up about 7 points in terms of net approval. Today, he's down 10 points. So you can see that there's a considerable decrease in overall support. But I am going to say that, again, a presidential election is very different than a Virginia governor's race. That's what I pointed out also in my Virginia video back, in my most recent one, actually, the Virginia Shift video. In addition to that, you are looking at a race that is going to be much more contentious and much more impactful than a simple governor's race. People can express their discontent. For instance, when you take a look at the 2018 results in Kansas, they elected a Democratic governor, yet 2 years later voted for Donald Trump by a margin of nearly 15 points. That is noticeable. That is something that needs to be pointed out. Yes, the voters here were momentarily disregarding Donald Trump and did not want his agenda to be fully pushed upon them, but yet they voted for him in the presidential election. The same can be said about many of these other races that got exceptionally close, including another governor's race in Alaska, where we actually saw the GOP candidate only win by a margin of about 6 points. Donald Trump went on to win by 10 points. In addition to that, you take a look around the nation for the 2018 results, you can see many races were much closer than they were on the presidential level, because voters can express momentary discontent, but still recognize the very real severity of an election, the very real implications of a presidential election. And consequently, they won't shift as much as you might think. And that's also something that I do want to point out. But as we get through this, there is no denying that Donald Trump is going to do better now than he did in the past. Joe Biden has lost significant ground across voters across the nation, which means that many of these races are going to be more heavily in favor of Donald Trump. For instance, Florida is peeking right on the edge of being a likely state for Donald Trump. I am tempted to see it as a 5 to 6 point margin of victory. In fact, that might be a very real reality. But you also have to recognize that states such as Florida are almost always close. While Donald Trump may have an individual advantage there amongst minority voters in shifting them, you also do have to realize that, again, he's a failed candidate, which will push voters away, even if he is running against an unpopular president. In addition to that, you are looking at a state that is almost always close, and I would expect it to be just as close. Even actually in more recent numbers, as we have seen today on Real Clear Politics, Marco Rubio actually doesn't take as much of a lead as I previously thought. He actually won by more than 7 points in 2016. For him to be performing worse for 2022 is quite interesting, if you ask me. For Ron DeSantis, who is previously, someone who was wickedly popular across the state, to only be up 6 points against Charlie Crist, a 2-time failed Republican or independent statewide nominee, is very noticeable. Democratic nominee, actually. Democrat or independent, won as a Republican. Crazy things that happened. Nikki Fried, the last Democrat to win a statewide race in the state of Florida, down 9 points. But yet, previous polls have shown larger leads for Ron DeSantis. So I do think that Florida does have that inherent nature of getting pretty close. I do think that the state of Virginia will remain likely, and I say that not because I expect it to be a 10-point margin, a 9-point margin, but more on the 5 to 6 point edge. Virginia, at the end of the day, still is a state that does favor Democrats. They have had the victories here disregarding 2021 for the past near decade, and that cannot be understated. Just because there was a momentary victory for the GOP in Virginia doesn't mean it's a done deal for Democrats. And it certainly doesn't mean that they don't dislike Donald Trump any more than they did in the past, or any less than they did in the past. Donald Trump was that negative name that arguably brought Glenn Youngkin down. Had Donald Trump not been the Republican nominee for president in 2020, Glenn Youngkin probably would have had a much better election in 2021. Terry McAuliffe might have had a better campaign, but at the end of the day, that election, historically speaking, should have gone to the Republicans. Not making excuses for Democrats, because Republicans and Democrats time and time again have broken historical precedent, just as many of these bellwether states and counties no longer are bellwethers following the 2020 or even 2016 presidential election. But looking at the state of Virginia, I point that out simply as a state that is a blue state at heart, just simply preferred Glenn Youngkin and Republicans at that moment in time, but when it comes down to the actual election, I really don't see it happening that way. No doubt in my mind that Iowa and Ohio remain states that are likely for the GOP. North Carolina would remain lean. I would see that New Mexico and Colorado probably would remain likely states, but when you're looking at the map itself, it's not going to be super solid as they were before. Colorado and New Mexico are states where you could see rapid reductions. You're talking about maybe a 5 to 6 point victory for Joe Biden, and potentially, you're talking 6 to 7 points in Colorado as it stands right now. For the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, these are states that voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. First of all, Maine 2nd District, I think, moves over into being safe for the Republican Party. And just looking at the decreased amounts of support, I would see Donald Trump winning this election. I do think that at the end of the day, he will have the upper hand in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And that's just how it stands right now. I'm saying this as a point that I do think that it is entirely recoverable for the Republicans and Democrats to have a complete flip-flop, where Republicans lose the Rust Belt again and Democrats are able to win there, just as it was in 2020. But also the Republicans could replicate what they saw in 2016. I also see this as something that is just going to point out the decreased amount of support for Joe Biden across the nation. You are looking at a new map where, Donald Trump is probably going to win Georgia again. He's probably going to win Arizona again under our current circumstances. And honestly speaking, it's very possible that he could do well in other states. I wouldn't be shocked if he was able to solidify Texas down even further, even though it's had a leftward trend over the past couple of elections. For Nebraska's 2nd District to previously be, Democrat plus 7 points, I'm thinking, yes, it narrows down into a tilt district, but not at all that safe. But actually, no, it doesn't, because I just realized we're working with a new district where Nebraska's 2nd probably would be Republican leaning. And I say that because it is more Republican leaning than it was in the past. Just looking at the electoral map in general, though, you're not going to see some type of landslide election for Donald Trump. Think about the person that is running to. You're still looking at someone who's disapproved of across the nation, even being out of office, by about 11 points nationwide. Barack Obama has a positive approval rating nationwide. That's mainly because he's out of office and out of the fray. During his lame duck period, he finished with a plus 16-point approval rating nationwide. So Obama and many presidents preceding him have left with positive approval ratings because they're no longer in the fray. Donald Trump is still disapproved of. You cannot deny that rerunning a candidate ultimately puts you in a more jeopardizing position. Had this been Ron DeSantis, I'm telling you the map would be different, and we will explore that in a future video. But for right now, a rematch, I think, is the most likely outcome for 2024, and as it stands today, with Joe Biden at this point in time, considering how the race stood just a year ago, considering how the race stands now, and looking at many of these things. A snapshot in time is what we are exploring right now. And this snapshot tells us that Donald Trump would win the presidency if it was held today. And I also would move over the state of New Hampshire into the Donald Trump column narrowly. I think this is probably going to be an extremely close race, but I think Joe Biden certainly has decreased the amount of support he has previously won in many of these states. While Democrats historically have had the advantage in the state of Nevada, I also would not be surprised if Donald Trump was able to win there. Tapping into anti-Biden sentiment would be beneficial for Donald Trump right now. But there still are voters out there that I certainly see as anti-Trump. They are 100% out there. But just looking at our main map, looking at our main at-large, looking specifically here too, just because this is my final characterization, you see the consolidation of a lot of this support. Maine's 2nd district was likely for Trump, probably would move over into being safe. They've shifted pretty much to the right, really didn't shift that much back in 2020. Maine's 1st district, I previously characterized it as safe, realized they needed to make it likely. Well, now it's likely for the Democrats, not super solid. In Maine at large, I would say the Democrats would be able to win it, but you're looking at decreased amounts of support across the state. Joe Biden won Maine by single digits back in 2020, so you could see probably a 4.5-point shift here, just as you might be seeing across the nation. For instance, in a state such as Michigan, which voted for Biden by 3 points, now is in the lean column for Donald Trump. At the bare minimum, it shifts by a margin of about 3 points across the state. I'm expecting it to shift by a little bit larger of an amount. For Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, still pretty contentious states. Pennsylvania, a state that Biden won by 1 point, nothing out of the question here to see Trump winning by 2 or 3 points. These margins here, of course, are left within these boundaries because they could fluctuate anywhere between 1 to 5% without any type of major change in the overall electoral map. But just taking a look at our final map here, there are very clear ways of showing, and I think that it comes out very clear in this map, that Joe Biden has lost major amounts of support across the nation. No longer is Nebraska's first likely Republican. No longer is Kansas considered to be likely Republican. Many of these states solidify for Donald Trump, in fact, shift over into his column where he actually wins this 2024 matchup. Nevada flips, Arizona flips, Georgia flips, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Hampshire. 7 states flip red. But of course, this is something that is really dependent on the campaigns that these two run. Just looking at their previous bids, I would say this is the map I am comfortable solidifying on as it stands today, with Joe Biden disapproved of by 10 points nationwide. With understanding that the map itself isn't always indicative of what our numbers are in terms of overall approval. People aren't exactly as opposed to a president as it might be displayed in the approval rating. And I learned that the hard way by overestimating Democratic support back in 2020. Some might argue I might be overestimating Democratic support now. Some of you might argue that I'm overestimating Republican support. That's all fair to say because we are talking about a political discussion and a political prediction. But this is my own. Again, do not take this as my finalized 2024 prediction, meaning the end-all be-all. There will certainly be another one of these. I am telling you that right now. This is a mere snapshot of how the race stands today ahead of the 2024 presidential race. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.